A young millionaire thought she was just a nanny, but she stole his heart forever. The warm scent of fresh-baked cookies greeted Sophie Harper as she stepped into the sprawling kitchen of the estate. She had baked them as a thank-you gesture for the new family she was about to work for, and as she stood there in her plain sweater and worn jeans, she felt undeniably out of place in the palatial home. The marble counters gleamed under the sunlight pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the pristine decor whispered of wealth she couldn't even begin to imagine. But none of it distracted her from the piercing gaze of the man standing across from her. "You're late," Damien Carlisle said, his voice cool and clipped. His expression was unreadable, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. The young billionaire had a presence that could fill a room effortlessly, and right now Sophie felt like a speck of dust under his scrutiny. There was traffic, Sophie stammered, clutching the plate of cookies like a shield. In truth, she'd gotten lost, too nervous to trust her GPS as she navigated the winding driveway that seemed longer than most city streets. "Traffic," Damien repeated, the corner of his mouth twitching, as though debating whether or not to smirk. "Well, Miss Harper, I trust your punctuality will improve. My son has a strict schedule, and I have little patience for." "Daddy," a small voice interrupted him, and before Sophie could respond, a blur of blonde curls and energy barreled into the room. A boy, no older than 5, launched himself at Damien with a toothy grin. "Daddy, you said we'd play today." Damien's stern expression softened instantly as he bent down to lift his son into his arms. "I said after work, Theo," he said, his tone gentler now. "But since our new nanny has arrived, maybe she can play with you instead." Theo turned to Sophie with wide, curious eyes. "Are you my new babysitter?" "Nanny," Damien corrected, standing to his full height again. "She'll be taking care of you while I'm at work." Sophie smiled, kneeling to Theo's level. "That's right. And I brought cookies. Want one?" Theo's face lit up, but Damien's sharp voice cut in before the boy could reply. "He doesn't need sugar right now. His tutor will be here in 10 minutes. Sophie blinked, taken aback by the strictness in his tone. "Oh, of course. Maybe later then." Damien didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, his demeanor back to its frosty default. "I'll leave you both to it. Theo's schedule is on the fridge." Follow it exactly with that, he strode out of the room, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. As the door swung shut behind him, Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well," she said, turning back to Theo with a conspiratorial smile, "looks like it's just you and me, buddy. What do you say we make this fun?" Theo giggled, his shyness melting away. "Can we play superheroes?" "Superheroes it is," Sophie said, her initial nerves fading as she saw the joy in his eyes. "But first, let's see what this schedule says. We wouldn't want to break any rules, would we?" Over the next few weeks, Sophie settled into her new role in the Carlisle household. Theo was a bright, affectionate boy who quickly became the highlight of her days. He adored her silly voices during story time, and she loved how his laughter could fill the cavernous halls of the otherwise cold mansion. Damien, however, was another story. He was distant, always buried in work or meetings, and when he did interact with her, his words were curt and impersonal. Yet Sophie couldn't ignore the moments when his icy exterior seemed to thaw, like when Theo fell and scraped his knee, and Damien had rushed to his side with genuine concern, his voice trembling as he asked if his son was okay. Or the way he lingered in the doorway sometimes, watching Sophie and Theo play, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. One evening, Sophie was sitting on the back patio with Theo, helping him with a puzzle, when Damien appeared unexpectedly. He was still in his work clothes, but his tie was loosened, and there was a rare softness in his expression. "Theo, it's bedtime," he said, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "5 more minutes, Daddy," Theo pleaded, holding up a puzzle piece. "We're almost done." Damien hesitated, his gaze shifting to Sophie. "Is he behaving?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Always, Sophie replied with a smile. He's a great kid. There was a pause, and then, to her surprise, Damien stepped closer and crouched beside them. All right, he said, picking up a piece himself. Let's finish it together. Sophie watched in amazement as Damien joined in, his usual guarded demeanor replaced by something almost human. For the first time, she saw the man beneath the billionaire, the father who adored his son, the man who was trying his best despite the weight of the world on his shoulders. As they completed the puzzle, Theo clapped in delight, and Damien's laughter, low and genuine, sent a strange warmth through Sophie's chest. She caught his eye, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw something there. Gratitude, maybe. Or something deeper. Thank you, he said quietly, as he picked Theo up to carry him to bed. And as he walked away, Sophie couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Damien Carlisle than met the eye. The change was subtle at first. Damien began to linger a little longer during their interactions, asking Sophie how Theo was doing or casually inquiring about her day. He even smiled once or twice, a real smile, not the polite, practiced one he reserved for business meetings. And Sophie, against her better judgment, began to notice things about him too, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the way his voice softened when he spoke to Theo, the way he carried himself with a quiet strength that hinted at the vulnerabilities he kept hidden. But she reminded herself that he was her boss and she was just the nanny. Anything more was impossible. At least, that's what she told herself until the night everything changed. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and roses from the Carlisle estate's expansive gardens. Sophie had just tucked Theo into bed after reading him his favorite superhero story for the 4th time that week. She smiled to herself as she turned off his bedside lamp, watching the small rise and fall of his chest as sleep took over. For all the chaos swirling around her in this new chapter of her life, Theo was her anchor, a bright, steady light that made her days meaningful. When she returned downstairs, she found the house quieter than usual. Normally, the staff would still be bustling about, tending to the endless upkeep a mansion like this demanded. But tonight, the halls seemed deserted. It wasn't until she heard the faint clink of glass from the library that she realized someone else was still awake. She hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to interrupt. But before she could make up her mind, Damien's voice called out from within the room. I know you're there, Miss Harper, you might as well come in. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried that usual undercurrent of authority that made her feel like a schoolgirl caught sneaking out past curfew. Taking a steadying breath, Sophie stepped inside. The library was a masterpiece of dark wood shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, crammed with books that looked old enough to be artifacts. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light over Damien, who sat in one of the leather armchairs near the hearth. He had a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand and an unreadable expression on his face. Sorry, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to disturb you. You're not disturbing me, he replied, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Have a seat. She hesitated for a moment before obeying, perching on the edge of the chair as though she might bolt at any second. Her hands rested awkwardly in her lap, and she avoided his gaze, instead letting her eyes wander over the titles lining the shelves. Some were classics she recognized, others were in languages she couldn't begin to decipher. Do you read much? Damien asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. I try to, when I have time. But it's been a while since I've read anything other than children's books. He chuckled lightly, the sound low and surprisingly warm. Theo's made you an expert on superheroes, I take it. She smiled, relaxing slightly. You have no idea. I think I could recite his favorite stories in my sleep. There was a pause, and then Damien leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied her. You're good with him, he said. Better than I expected. Sophie blinked, unsure how to respond. Was that a compliment? From Damien Carlisle? It felt weightier than it should have, as though he didn't hand out praise lightly. Thank you, she said at last. He's a great kid. It's easy to love him. Damien's gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. He's all I have, he admitted quietly. Since his mother. He trailed off, and Sophie didn't press him. She'd heard bits and pieces from the house staff whispers about Damien's late wife, a car accident, and how he'd thrown himself into work afterward, trying to bury his grief under the weight of his responsibilities. But hearing it from him, seeing the shadow that crossed his face, made it feel more real. I can tell you love him, she said gently. Even if you don't always show it the way he might want. Damien's jaw tightened. I'm doing the best I can, he said, almost defensively. I know, Sophie replied quickly, and so does he. But he's a little boy. He doesn't care about schedules or routines. He just wants his dad. Her words hung in the air between them. And for a moment she worried she'd overstepped. But instead of snapping at her, Damien leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. You're right, he said finally. I've been so focused on making sure everything runs smoothly, on giving him the best life money can buy, that I've forgotten what really matters. Sophie felt a pang of sympathy for him. Beneath the polished exterior, Damien was just a man trying to navigate fatherhood the best way he knew how. And for all his flaws, his love for Theo was undeniable. You're not alone in this, you know, she said softly. Theo has you, and now he has me too. We're a team. Damien's eyes met hers then, and something shifted in the air between them. The distance he usually kept so carefully seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw, unguarded truth of who he was: a father, a widower, a man trying to rebuild his life one piece at a time. Thank you, Sophie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For everything. She nodded, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Always. In the days that followed, Sophie noticed a change in Damien. He began spending more time with Theo, joining them for breakfast instead of rushing out the door with a coffee in hand. He even surprised them one afternoon by showing up during playtime, challenging Theo to a superhero trivia contest that left the boy squealing with delight. Sophie watched these moments with a mix of admiration and something else, something she wasn't ready to name. Damien was still, at his core, the same stoic, commanding presence he'd always been. But now, there were cracks in the armor, glimpses of the man underneath. And the more she saw, the harder it became to deny the pull she felt toward him. One evening, as they were tidying up after dinner, Damien caught her arm gently, stopping her in her tracks. Sophie, he said, his voice unusually soft, can I ask you something? Of course, she replied, her heart pounding in her chest. Why do you do this, he asked. Why take a job like this when you could be doing anything else? The question took her by surprise, and she hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But the sincerity in his eyes compelled her to answer honestly. I love children, she said simply. And I needed a fresh start. My life, it wasn't going the way I thought it would. And when this opportunity came up, it felt like a sign. Like maybe this was where I was meant to be. Damien studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. I think Theo and I are lucky that you felt that way, he said at last. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow, leaving only the two of them in the glow of the kitchen lights. But before either of them could say anything more, Theo's voice echoed down the hall, calling for Sophie to help him find his favorite stuffed animal. The moment broke and Sophie stepped back, her cheeks flushing. I should go check on him, she said quickly. Damien nodded, his expression unreadable. Good night, Sophie. Good night, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, as she hurried down the hallway. As she helped Theo search for his stuffed bear, her mind raced, trying to make sense of the feelings swirling inside her. She'd come here for a job, nothing more. But now, with each passing day, she found herself drawn deeper into the lives of the Carlisle family and into the heart of a man she wasn't sure she could ever fully understand. The next few weeks unfolded like the steady turning of pages in a novel that neither Sophie nor Damien had expected to find themselves a part of. Their interactions, once guarded and strictly professional, began to take on a new rhythm, one marked by fleeting moments of vulnerability, accidental laughs, and the unspoken understanding that something unnameable was shifting between them. Damien still carried his usual air of authority, but Sophie noticed a subtle softening around the edges. He asked about her day more often, not in a perfunctory way, but with genuine interest. He lingered during Theo's playtime, joining in here and there under the guise of keeping an eye on things. And while his focus on his work remained relentless, Sophie caught glimpses of a man who was slowly learning to let his guard down. For Sophie, the change was equally disarming. She found herself looking forward to the moments when Damien would appear, his presence an unspoken promise of safety and constancy. It wasn't just his charm, though she'd be lying if she said she wasn't affected by the way his voice could wrap around a room, or the way his rare, unguarded smiles could light up even the coldest corners of the estate. It was the way he made her feel seen, as though she wasn't just an employee or a convenient caretaker, but someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered. It wasn't lost on her that this growing closeness was dangerous. She'd taken this job to rebuild her life, to leave behind the wreckage of a past she wasn't ready to confront. Falling for her boss, especially one as complicated and guarded as Damien Carlisle, wasn't part of the plan. And yet, every time their eyes met across a room or their hands brushed in passing, Sophie felt the tenuous strands of her resolve begin to unravel. The tipping point came one rainy evening in early spring. A storm had rolled in unexpectedly, drenching the sprawling gardens and wrapping the house in a cocoon of wind and thunder. Sophie was sitting in the living room with Theo, who was building an elaborate structure out of Legos and narrating a superhero story as he worked. "Theo Harper saves the day again," he declared, holding up a miniature Lego figure triumphantly. "You mean Theo Carlisle," Sophie corrected gently, though her heart swelled at his use of her last name. "Nope," Theo said with a grin. "I'm Theo Harper today." Before Sophie could respond, Damien appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately grounding the room. He'd changed out of his usual suit and tie, wearing a soft sweater and dark jeans that made him look less like the aloof billionaire Sophie had first met, and more like a man who might actually belong to this moment. "What's all this?" Damien asked, his tone lighter than usual as he crossed the room and knelt beside Theo. "It's my superhero tower," Theo exclaimed, pointing proudly at the precarious-looking structure. Sophie helped. Damien glanced at Sophie, his expression unreadable but warm. "Did she now?" "It was mostly him," Sophie said quickly, feeling her cheeks heat under Damien's gaze. "I'm just here for moral support." Theo beamed, clearly proud of his creation. "Daddy, do you want to help?" Damien hesitated, glancing at the papers he'd brought with him, evidence of yet another late-night work session. But then he set them aside, sinking fully onto the floor beside Theo. "All right," he said. "Tell me what to do." For the next hour, the three of them worked together, adding to the tower and inventing increasingly elaborate stories about Theo's superhero alter ego. The storm raged on outside, but within the cozy circle of the living room, time seemed to stand still. When the tower finally collapsed in a dramatic burst of Legos, Theo let out an exaggerated groan before collapsing into a fit of giggles. "That was awesome," he declared, his laughter infectious. Damien chuckled, ruffling Theo's hair. "You're a good architect, buddy." Sophie watched the interaction, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and longing. Seeing Damien like this, relaxed, playful, and utterly devoted to his son, was a side of him she wished the world could see more often. It was a side she was beginning to cherish more than she cared to admit. Later that evening, after Theo had been tucked into bed, and the house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Sophie found herself in the kitchen, making tea to help calm the thoughts swirling in her mind. She was startled when Damien walked in, his footsteps unusually soft against the tiled floor. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low enough to feel intimate in the stillness of the room. Sophie shook her head. just needed a moment to unwind. Damien nodded, stepping closer. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms in a way that made him seem both casual and commanding. "Thank you for tonight," he said after a pause, "for spending so much time with Theo. It means more than I can say." "It's not a chore," Sophie replied honestly. "He's a wonderful kid and he clearly adores you." Damien's gaze dropped to the floor, a shadow passing over his features. "I worry sometimes," he admitted, "that I'm not enough for him. That I'm failing him in ways I can't fix." "You're not failing him," Sophie said firmly, her voice tinged with a rare boldness. "The way he looks at you, the way he lights up when you're around, that's not the reaction of a kid who feels neglected or unloved." Damien looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," Sophie said softly. "Sometimes the hardest thing is just being present. And you've been doing that more and more." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, as though the storm outside had slipped into the room and wrapped itself around them. Sophie's heart raced, and she knew that she should look away, step back, anything to break the spell. But then Damien took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Sophie." Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she held his gaze, caught in the magnetic pull of whatever was happening between them. The sound of a distant thunderclap broke the moment, and Damien stepped back, running a hand through his hair as if to shake himself free. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tight. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Sophie interrupted, though her cheeks burned and her hands trembled around her mug. I should get to bed." Damien nodded, his jaw tense. "Good night, Sophie." "Good night," she murmured, slipping past him and out of the kitchen. That night, Sophie lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling as the storm outside finally began to wane. Her mind replayed the moment in the kitchen over and over, dissecting every glance, every word, every step. She told herself that nothing had really happened, that they'd simply been caught up in the emotions of the evening. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something had shifted between them. Something she wasn't sure she could ignore. The following morning dawned with an almost surreal quiet, the storm having passed, leaving the world washed anew in the soft glow of early sunlight. Sophie rose earlier than usual, driven by a restless energy she couldn't quite shake. Her mind was still tangled with the events of the previous night, the warmth in Damien's eyes, the way her name had sounded on his lips, and the unspoken charge that had passed between them in the kitchen. It wasn't something she could ignore, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise. By the time she made her way downstairs, the house was already coming alive. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the halls, and the faint clatter of the cleaning staff tidying the breakfast room gave the estate a sense of rhythm. Sophie stepped into the kitchen, intent on starting her day as normally as possible, only to find Damien already there, a coffee mug in hand and an uncharacteristically relaxed look on his face. He glanced up as she entered, and for a moment their eyes met. The ease of routine faltered as the memory of the previous night loomed between them like an invisible thread, taut and unbroken. "Good morning," he said, his tone measured but not unkind. "Morning," Sophie replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She moved to the counter, busying herself with the kettle, as if the mundane task could shield her from the weight of his gaze. "I thought I'd take Theo to the park today," Damien said after a pause, his voice cutting through the silence. "He mentioned something about wanting to show you his favorite climbing tree." Sophie turned to him, surprised. "You're taking the morning off?" Damien's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. A father can't spend time with his son without it being a national event. "No," Sophie said quickly, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "It's just not something I've seen you do before." He nodded, his expression softening. "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About being present. I'm trying to take that to heart." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard, and for a fleeting moment she saw the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet admission that he didn't have all the answers, and it made her chest tighten in ways she wasn't ready to name. "I think that's a great idea," Sophie said, her smile genuine. "Theo will love it." Damien's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if searching for something unsaid, before he nodded. "Good." Then it settled. By mid-morning, the three of them were at the park, the day unfolding with a sort of unhurried ease that felt almost foreign to Damien. He watched as Theo scampered ahead, his small hands gripping the edge of a climbing structure with the kind of boundless energy only a 5-year-old could muster. Sophie stood nearby, her laughter ringing out as Theo called for her to follow him up the ladder. Damien found himself captivated by the scene. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Sophie with Theo, far from it, but there was something about the way she moved through the world with such effortless warmth that struck him anew. She had a way of making every moment feel important, of giving her full attention to even the smallest interactions, and it was a quality he found himself admiring more than he cared to admit. "Come on, Daddy," Theo's voice jolted him from his thoughts. The boy was perched at the top of the structure now, waving enthusiastically. "You have to climb too." Damien hesitated, glancing at Sophie for reassurance. She grinned, her eyes dancing with amusement. Better not disappoint him, she teased. With a sigh that was more performative than genuine, Damien shrugged off his jacket and made his way to the climbing structure. Theo cheered as he reached the top, and Damien couldn't help but smile at the boy's unbridled excitement. "You did it," Theo exclaimed, throwing his arms around his father in a triumphant hug. Damien's chest tightened at the simple gesture, and he ruffled Theo's hair. "Of course I did. I'm your dad, remember? I can do anything." Sophie watched the exchange from below, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and longing she couldn't quite define. The sight of Damien, usually so composed and controlled, laughing with his son, his guard completely down, was a side of him she knew few people ever got to see. It made her wonder how much more there was to the man behind the polished facade. And before she could stop herself, she found herself imagining what it might be like to be a part of this small, imperfect family in a more permanent way. The thought was as thrilling as it was terrifying, and she quickly pushed it aside, reminding herself of the boundaries she'd drawn when she'd first taken this job. But as the day wore on, those boundaries felt increasingly tenuous, like sand slipping through her fingers. By the time they returned to the estate, Theo was exhausted but happy, his eyelids drooping as Damien carried him inside. Sophie followed, her heart caught somewhere between contentment and uncertainty. She busied herself tidying up the living room while Damien put Theo down for a nap, grateful for the distraction. When Damien returned, he found her folding a blanket on the couch. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low. Sophie looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For this," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "For today. For Theo, for everything you've done since you came into our lives." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his tone, and she set the blanket aside, turning to face him fully. "You don't have to thank me, Damien. I love spending time with him. And with you." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and her cheeks flushed as she realized what she'd said. Damien's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly still. "With me," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She could backtrack, laugh it off, pretend it hadn't meant anything. But the truth hung heavy in the air between them, and she knew there was no point in denying it. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling. "With you." Damien took a step closer, his expression unreadable but intense. "Sophie." Her name on his lips was all it took to break the dam she'd been holding back for weeks. Every stolen glance, every fleeting touch, every unspoken feeling she'd buried came rushing to the surface, and before she knew it, she was speaking again. I know this is complicated, she said, her voice trembling. And I know I'm just the nanny and there are a million reasons why this shouldn't happen. But I care about you, Damien. More than I ever meant to. For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze locked on hers, as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture so tentative it made her breath catch. Sophie, he said again, his voice rough with emotion. You're not just the nanny, you've become so much more than that. To Theo. To me. His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she felt the last of her defenses crumble. Whatever this was, whatever it could become, it was real, and it was worth the risk. Before either of them could say anything more, the sound of Theo's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs, a reminder of the life they were both tied to and the child who had brought them together. Sophie smiled, her heart full as she met Damien's gaze. Let's figure this out, she said softly. Together. Damien nodded, his expression a mix of determination and something she could only describe as hope. Together, he agreed. And in that moment, Sophie knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they were no longer hers to face alone.